This video will be solving quadratics using square roots with imaginary solutions this time. I have two previous videos with real solutions and solutions that are fractions. All right, so on example 1, we will notice that we have an expression that's squared, so binomial squared, basically. So just imagine that as being x squared, like I said in another video. And in order to get rid of that square, what you would have to do is the inverse. You would just do that, right? So you're going to do the exact same thing, and I'm just going to rewrite it, but you don't have to. So I'm going to take the square root of the quantity of x minus 3 squared, and what I do to one side, I have to do to the other, but I have to do that plus or minus first. And so now I'm going to take the square root of negative 75. So that negative under the radical indicates to you that you're going to have an imaginary solution. So let's go ahead, and since we took the inverse, which was the radical, we're going to scratch that out, and now we're going to bring down what was under it, which is your radicand. So I'm going to set that equal to plus or minus, and I'm going to try to go ahead and simplify this radical. Well, I know that negative means that I'm going to bring out an I, and then 75, I think of quarters, so 25 cents, and how many do I need to make 75? Well, I need 3 of those. Since that negative 75 is under a radical, I want to put those factors under a radical as well. Why? Because now that shows me that I can further simplify the square root of 25, which is going to be 5. I can't do anything with that radical 3, so I'm going to have to leave it under the radical, and the I cannot stay under the radical. It has to come out. So the way I write it is plus or minus 5i radical 3. Now, what I told you in another video is take this number that's next to the x, and you want to move it in front of your plus or your minus, but you need to change the sign because you're going across the equal sign. So this is now going to be x is equal to 3 plus or minus 5i radical 3. This is how I like my students to write their answers. However, if you're putting it in the form of a plus bi, where A represents your real part and BI represents your imaginary part, then you would write it as 3 plus or minus 5 radical 3. Make sure that I is not under the radical. So this is also acceptable. I just prefer this one. All right, so going on to example 2. We notice that we don't have a b. Like in our standard form, we have ax squared plus bx plus c. We don't have a b. We have a constant that we can combine. So we're just going to move that constant over to the other side by taking the inverse. The inverse is the opposite sign. So now I bring down the 10v squared, and negative 89 plus negative 6 is going to give me negative 95. I'm trying to get v by itself, so I have to keep dwindling away at it. So I'm going to take that 10 that's in front of it and get rid of that. And I'm left with v squared is equal to negative 95 over 10. Actually, I'm going to simplify this. I know that I can divide both of these by 5. So when I do that, 95 divided by 5 is going to be 19. And then 10 divided by 5 is 2. So at this point, I want to get rid of this square. How do I do it? I take the inverse. So I take the square root of both sides, but I want to do plus or minus. And instead of making a big radical, I'm going to separate it. So the numerator is going to be a square root and the denominator. So now on the top, I notice the only thing I can take out is an I. Again, if I ever see a negative under my radical, I am definitely going to take out an I. Don't forget that. The bottom is square root of 2. There's nothing that I can do with that. So we're going to keep going. The whole purpose of taking the inverse was to scratch something out. So now I'm left with a v. V is going to be plus or minus I times the radical 19 all over radical 2. Well, I can't leave that radical 2 in my denominator. I'm going to have to rationalize it. How do I do that? I multiply the numerator and the denominator by the radical I'm trying to get rid of. And I'm going to go ahead and multiply across. That's what you do with fractions. So 19 times 2 is under a radical, and it's going to be plus or minus I times radical 38. And then on the bottom, radical 2 times radical 2 is simply going to be 2, because it's really the square root of 4, and the square root of 4 is 2. As I said once before, if you multiply a radical times itself, it's automatically going to be the radicand. It will always be that. So this is my final answer. Again, this is how I like to have my students write it, but if you wanted to write it as plus or minus radical 38 over 2, when you're writing it as a fraction, it can either go in the numerator or it can go like in between. It cannot go in the denominator. So one or the two of these are acceptable. But make sure you're careful where that I is going, because it cannot go, like I said, in the denominator, or, yeah, it can't go in the denominator or under the radical itself. All right, and the last example is example 3. Same thing, I'm missing my B term, so I want to go ahead and move all my constants over on the right-hand side. So I'm going to have, for some reason, my pen is doing something. All right, so I'm going to have a -7 and a -7. And now I just bring down that 15x squared is equal to, and once I add, when I have the same sign, I'm going to add, I'm going to bring that sign down. 20 plus 7 is 27. So now what I want to do is divide both sides by 15. Do not try to take the square root yet. Some of you do that. You want to get x squared by itself before you start trying to take the square root. All right, on this side, see if you can simplify it. And we can divide both of these by 3. So let's go ahead and do that first. And so we have -9 over 5. -9 divided by 5 does not give us a whole number. So we're going to do what we were doing a few minutes ago. We're going to take the square root of both sides. However, on this side, we're going to just do the numerator and then the denominator separately. So x is going to equal plus or minus. Now I'm going to go back up here and see if there's anything I can take out. Well, I see the negative sign, so I definitely know I can take an I out. And then the square root of 9 is 3 times 3. So there's my pair. Square root of 5, I can't do anything with. So 3i is in my numerator, and then the square root of 5 is in my denominator. We cannot keep that in the denominator. You can't have a radical in the denominator. So I'm going to rationalize. Square root of 5 over square root of 5. And now what I want to do is just multiply across. When I multiply across, I have a 3 and a radical 5. I cannot combine them under the radical, so I'm going to have them separate. I have 3i times radical 5. And on the bottom, I already told you, if you multiply it times itself, it's simply the radicand. So my answer for that one is going to be 3i radical 5 over 5. That's the way I want you to write it as my student. Or you can write it as plus or minus 3 radical 5 over 5. And then the I is like in between, because if you put it on the top, you want to make sure it does not look like it's under that radical. Otherwise, it's going to be incorrect. All right. Like and subscribe. Have an awesome one.